Ich könnte jetzt. Method Missing meinst du, oder was? Method Missing, oder was meinst du mit Unterschrift? Ja, hast natürlich recht. Ich könnte ja mal schnell pushen. Ist ja alles im Repo. I did not? Damn. Oh, thanks. Ach, come on.
Right, well, Andreas is committing some last minute fixes. Hopefully the internet holds up for doing that. Yeah, welcome to the second session. I should probably go over here so the microphone can pick me up a little bit. Cool. So let me quickly introduce Andreas. Andreas and me, we share a common passion, French toast. I think during the last talk, the Edinburgh Scottish Ruby Conference was mentioned, and we actually spent some time during that conference at an apartment, and we had some great French toast and also some really delicious beers as well. And I can't really say much more about Andreas, so give him a warm round of applause and take a
I wasn't briefed on which microphone to speak in, or do I not speak in any microphone? Can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah, hello, my name is Andreas, as you already heard, and I lived a long time here in Hamburg. I started my Ruby developer career here. Nowadays I live in Barcelona and usually work remote. And I would like to introduce settings to you, or better to speak, like a clean way of adding custom configuration values to your own applications, to any Ruby application, not only Rails. It works with Rails, which has its own mechanism already, but if you have a Sinatra app or a Grape app or anything else, you won't find like the best way of doing it already there. So you have to come up with something yourself. It will not use method missing, and I just fixed that typo there. Now it has an underscore. Thanks, Jan. So the motivation, sorry, I have to stay here, I was told, before the camera, and I'm really bad, I love to walk around. The motivation for this talk was that while we're working at Solaris Bank, we don't have any Rails apps, but many, many different Ruby apps. And all of them had like some way of handling custom configuration. At some point, we had an issue in one of our apps. There was a bug. It didn't behave as expected. And then we had like several experienced developers spending a lot of time to figuring out why is it broken and what is actually broken. It's because we had such a convoluted custom configuration chaos. We didn't know where are these environment variables actually set. So in development and testing, we had the .env gem. So we had one way of setting them there. But then in the other environments, we would assume the .env gem is not used. So maybe the environment variable is set in the Docker setup. Or maybe it's actually coming from the server or whatever cloud custom infrastructure you have that gives you environment variables. And we also had to find out, oh, we're reading it more than once, and we're handling it in different ways. So which load order do these initializers have? When is which value set? It was chaotic. It took us time to figure out what was broken, and then we decided, okay, we have to clean this mess up. And we came up with a much nicer system to handle it. A system that I'm still using, and not only for any Ruby apps, but even in my Rails apps nowadays. And it's small, it's tiny. So one learning was, don't use env directly in your applications. Just don't. You don't want to read from your environment. You want to do it once on your boot time of your application at the very beginning. Like, these variables should be stable over the lifetime of your application, from boot till shutdown. And you then want to rely on those values you set in your code in some class. You also don't want to fail silently on typos. Maybe you, while developing, had a typo in the way you spelled your environment variable name, and you copied it into the code. But in the other environments, it's spelled differently. The app won't inform you about that. Maybe you realize there's a bug somewhere, but why? You won't know. If you have your custom configuration, you'll get at least a helpful error message. Usually, you also will want to use default values. So in development and testing, that's what you use the .env for. .env gem usually for is to set default values. I don't know, for like some endpoints or whatever. It might also be handy to use actually real objects for your configuration, not only strings, like a whole hash or more. We don't want to have another external dependency. Like, setting environment variables is something, or reading from environment variables and setting the values in your app, something incredibly small. You're setting values all the time. You don't need an external dependency for that. That's why you won't find a gem released. It's too small, and I don't want to have a gem. And we want to be able to use the same mechanism regardless of the environment, like unlike the .env gem, for example. And we wanted to have everything in one file. And that's something maybe I wanted more than others, but I want to keep the overview. I want people to come new to an app, to know where to look for it. Oh, it's under config/settings. Perfect. I open this file. I see the implementation. And below, I see which variables are registered. All of them that are used in the app are registered in one file, the custom ones. There might be others. Like, your Rails application has so many different variables set. I don't copy them all in that file. Only the custom ones, only the ones that are specific to our application. It also will allow you to add custom methods easily. And not only you as the creator of an application, but also maybe the junior developer who joins your project 2 years later. And then some requirements change. And you might be able to add something there because he sees the code, he knows exactly what's going on. It's simple. And I recommend to load this one file before anything else, so that you have it available from the very start. Otherwise, you end up having a mixture of, okay, and those few setup files I still need to read from the environment, and the others I don't. Nope, just load it on the very beginning. I mentioned it's small. There's not a lot of code. I can just show you all of the code. We're starting with a class called settings. And it has a class method called register. This register, we're passing to a variable name as the only parameter. Does it actually work? So inside of the method and the body, we're using a bit of meta programming. So if you're new to Ruby, maybe you haven't seen that. Maybe it looks a bit confusing to you. What is it actually doing? It's not doing anything, does it? It looks weird. But I can explain all the lines. So first line calls define singleton method. What is a singleton method? So we usually all say class method to it. But the correct term in Ruby would be singleton method. So we're defining a class method here, and the name of this class method is the name we just passed in as a parameter, the variable name. Inside of those curly braces, you have the body of the method you just defined. So you're just creating a new method. And our body is just a getter. We're reading from an instance variable. Instance variable get. As you know, instance variable all start with an at. and then the name we're just passing in as a parameter. So in this case, we have a class instance variable. It's basically the same as a normal instance variable, but it's on class level, not on the instance level. So that's the first method we defined. We have a getter. So now we also have to set the value of this instance variable we just declared up there. So below, we're saying instance variable set. Same name again. And then we're reading from our environment. Env is a hash in Ruby. So we're saying env.fetch in the first implementation of this, and then just variable name to s uppercase. Uppercase because the environment variables are by convention written in all uppercase letters. So we have already a working implementation. The way this will work is when you register a name, but there's no environment variable with this name, it will raise an error because we're just using fetch, fetching from a hash. That is not what we wanted. Maybe it's something you want to have, that your app directly throws an error while you're booting. Cool, there you have it. But we wanted to have the ability to set default values. As you can see, it's almost the same code, but now with the second parameter, default, and default has a default value of nil. And then the only change is down here in the environment fetch that we're using this default value. So now, when the environment variable with this name doesn't exist, it will use the default given. The default is by default nil, so it's just not there, which is fine in some cases. How do you use that one? Very simple. In the same class as we define those methods, we just call register. Register and the name, API URL. So it will look for an environment variable called API URL. If it finds one, it will use its value. If it doesn't find it, it will use the default we can pass. So let's say our API is locally running on the Sinatra app there, and the API endpoint. If I want to access it later in my app from anywhere, I can access it globally with settings.api URL. They have my value. So back to the method we just had, registering with default value. Right now it's a bit inflexible, because every time we want to set a value, we have to go through the register method. We also wanted to have the opportunity to set a value a bit later. Let's say to override what we already registered, override it for a specific environment, or for my local environment. Or maybe because some environment setting is not available yet, because it kind of depends on an external service. And if our Ruby app boots earlier, there might be the case that it's not available yet. So we are going to extract this lower part here, the instance variable set part, to its own method. And it looks like that. We have a second method called set, where we're doing instance variable set. And the whole default value handling we still do in the register part. Because only when we're registering a variable, we want to be able to set a default. Otherwise, we just want to say, set it to this value. How do you use set? In the same simple way, settings.set, my variable name, and the value I want to have in there. Use cases for me, for example, is like I have a settings.local file where I could override some values. So I don't have to change the code of everybody else, which is in the settings file. I have it in git ignore, so I could even put secrets in there. We would be done basically now. We have a mechanism to register and to set those values, and that's more or less all you need. But it can give us a little bit more. So it could help us to avoid comparison bugs. I've seen code like that a lot of times, and I bet you also have. It looks innocent. Just this line. If environment prints stack trace, then do something. Okay, so the expectation is either it doesn't exist or it exists and has true in it. And then it works, fine. But what if? On production, you want to be really sure that the print stack trace doesn't end up in your error messages and gives all your secret information away to the public. So somebody puts in this export of the environment variable with print stack trace is false. So let's go back to the code. You read it. If false, then do something. OK, that looks right. Oh, it's an environment variable, so false is actually a string. And strings are all truthy in Ruby, no matter what's their content. So you have to actually if true there, and that is not what you want, and you've got a bug. So this little method will help us to do comparisons. It will just cast both values, like the one in our settings and the one we pass through it to a string, and compare them. So that was good enough for us. So I mentioned before, if you want to have whole objects, maybe you need a different comparison method. Write one yourself. So we're comparing like this. We are safe. No matter if true is a Boolean value or a string, it will work. So we actually came from our convoluted custom configuration chaos and created a consistent, concise custom configuration. And it's absolutely beautiful. From there and ever on, we lived in bliss. No, it really helped us. Like we cleaned it up. We added it actually, I think, to almost all of the apps that were big enough to justify their usage. And to this day, I mentioned already, I'm still using it even in Rails apps. I mean, you know, Rails has their own files where you go over Rails application configuration, and then you usually make a .x and put your own names there, and you could put in whatever you want. And it works, if you have only Rails apps. But then most projects have so many services, so you have like different systems and different apps. In Rails, you do it like this. In your Sinatra or Grape app, you do it differently. So I think there's a benefit of always using the config settings file and put my custom configuration there, where I also don't have any long Rails comments on Rails default values, where I'm always confused. What is the default value right now? I keep most of the stuff in the Rails part, but let's say I add a mail server. Then I might move the setting for the mail host, the mail server, the default email address to my own file. So all our custom configuration values will be declared in one file. You can easily grab the code for its usage. So with environment variables, it works maybe as well, but then happens the case that somebody puts it in some variable name and it gets lost. And the idea is to not save it in a different variable name, but always go over the settings object, over the global object, so it's easier to grab. So load order is clear now, unless you overwrite it later, but even that should be done sparsely. I mean, theoretically, you could use it like a Rails current object. You could keep overwriting it. But that's not the idea of this little tool. That's for environment variables, for settings that should be stable from boot to shutdown of the app. And you can use the same mechanism regardless of the framework. So just to prove that it's so small, is that readable from there? Yeah? Nice. So that's the method I already mentioned before. We have the the set method, the register method, and the comparison method. And just below, I'm registering, for simplicity reasons, my variable names, my values. By the way, if you ever come to Barcelona and visit the Xing office, where we have the Ruby user group on every third Thursday of the month, that are the Wi-Fi credentials, so you're welcome. So all my settings just go in here, and then below here, as an example, I say, okay, load this config settings locals file, if it exists. And this file in my projects would already be in git ignore, so every developer can create such a file, override settings there, put even secrets in there if they want. And you can have the same mechanism basically for any Rails environment, for a file called development, testing, staging, production. I don't use it because then I have many, many files again, but maybe you want that. So that's what the settings local file would look like. Just setting them. And there's also a spec which proves you that actually those values are objects and not only strings. And it also has a test for the comparison method. So it didn't make it to my talk, because I just did it yesterday at work. We're in a greenfield project, and now this thing is moving to a Kubernetes cluster, because everybody needs a Kubernetes cluster nowadays. You can't just run a Ruby app, it's no longer possible. And because we're in a cluster, all our environment variables were namespaced. Namespaced with the name of the app. So now all environment variables would be called vcent, cockpit, whatever name I had before. And I don't want to, change all my code base wherever I use this variable. And I also don't want to put the name of the app inside everywhere, because I know what app I'm working in. So just added one line of code in this in the settings value that actually says, okay, if you give me a prefix and not only a default, I'm looking for an environment variable with this prefix. And the name inside of my app is still the same. There's one line that's easily extendable. And that's about it. So you can find the whole presentation and the code examples and a few more maybe on GitHub, where I'm media finger. The repository is called settings. And yeah, I'm happy that you all came here to this small little Vim room. Took a long way and to listen to my talk. Thank you.
So we actually have a little bit of time left, but instead of handing out a microphone and asking you to ask questions, I would just like you to, if you have questions or if you have answers, just come down and have a discussion right here. Thank you, Andreas, for your talk. And now it's almost, sorry? Yeah, now it's almost lunchtime. I don't know if the food is already available, but that's the next thing that happens. And then we're back here for 2:30, maybe. Yeah, so enjoy the lunch, and if you have any questions, just come down here. Thank you.